started. My name is Patrick Donohue, and this is amazing what has happened over the last couple of weeks because it's happened really fast. When I posted this session, I called it Crowdfunding Fact or Crap because frankly I was in the camp that was fairly skeptical that what has now become H.R. 3606 was going to actually even get figured out in the Senate and get hashed out. And here we are a couple weeks later. Not only was it figured out by the Senate, but it was also back to the House, and it was officially signed by President Obama on Thursday. So what a timely event to have this discussion. So just as a bit of background, my name is Patrick Donohue, and I'm just going to introduce everyone. We're going to go through a series of slides so we can set the stage of what crowdfunding is, what it has been, and what it could become. And all of our panelists are going to weigh in on their opinions. And this is meant to be a discussion among everyone to share opinions, thoughts, ask questions. And so we'll moderate that on the front end with the hashtag CapForum. On my right, starting from the audience, right to left, is Jeff Robbins, Joe Serrano, Harold Slawik, Zach Robbins, and Colin Hirdman. And we're going to jump right in and get going. So what is absolutely fascinating about crowdfunding and with digital media today is it essentially has become do-it-yourself finance. It is unprecedented the direct access that you have directly to investors today. And today for most people that looks like LinkedIn and Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And YouTube is really fascinating because if there's any subject on the planet of the earth that you're not sure about, what a great place to go and to learn about it than YouTube. That's now uploading something like 8 hours worth of video every second. And it's amazing what content is out there. And I do not have a major tech background, but a couple of years ago when some of my coworkers were talking about Ruby on Rails and PHP, I thought there was a new trend in drugs. And so I went to YouTube, and now I at least know what Ruby on Rails means and PHP and so forth. And it's amazing the availability of the tools and the resources that are out there today. And here's examples. On Twitter, you can find 13,400 people with right in their profile that have highlighted that they're an investor. 77 VC, 906 venture capitalists, 735 angel investors. This is just in the United States alone. And on the right-hand side, you'll see an example of what you pull up when you pull up these types of searches on Twitter. The same thing on LinkedIn. When you go to LinkedIn and you put in angel investors within a 100-mile radius of downtown Minneapolis zip code, you find 53 people that have angel investor right in their profile. So I'm here to say that real investors want to be found. They want to hear from people directly. They want to hear from the founders. They want to hear from the management teams because it's a litmus test for them. If the management teams of a company can't find an investor directly today, that means they're probably not savvy enough to go sell their own product or service. And I've heard that on Sand Hill Road. And that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about how to access capital. And now we're moving into an area of dedicated platforms where digital media is completely changing the face of finance with AngelList and Gust, which are the Match.coms of entrepreneurs and investors. Lending Club and Prosper.com, which are peer-to-peer lending networks that allow you to get loans directly from other people. And you completely eliminate the intermediary of a commercial bank. And then we have Indiegogo and Kickstarter, which really have been on the forefront of what is widely known as crowdfunding today. So I want to highlight two things for our purposes of our discussion today. And that there's traditional crowdfunding, and then there's equity crowdfunding, which is in large part what we're going to be talking about, especially as it relates to H.R. 3606. Crowdfunding started with platforms like Kickstarter, where performing artists needed to get enough money to produce their CD, to produce their film. Here's a gentleman right in Minneapolis, Brad Klein. He did this. He raised $17,000 for just under 200 people. This is traditional crowdfunding. He gave up no equity for that $17,000. He did it by giving people CDs, and people backed his project because they are fans of the Legends of Ska. Quick highlights on Kickstarter. Punchline is over $100 million has now flowed through this. As of this writing, this needs to be updated. This is 6 months old, but they just surpassed on the bottom bullet point, $800 million has actually been collected by companies. And in the past month, there have been 3 projects that have surpassed $1 million alone. And what's really neat about this is what started with performing artists now enables entrepreneurs to launch companies. You have the ability to put your product, your service out on Kickstarter. And if you're clever and you can think of some unique gifts to attract backers to your project, you can promote your project and essentially you can launch your company too. Like this gentleman out of Chicago that raised just shy of $1 million when he came up with an idea of a rubber wristband watch and the ability to insert the iPad Nano and to get an app that looks like the face of a watch. Now we're moving into equity crowdfunding. AngelList and Gust. Once again, Match.com directly putting investors in touch with entrepreneurs. They're tiptoeing around the legal fact today that you cannot generally solicit or advertise for investors. But what you do is you go into hyper networking mode and you find people and they become your referrals on these systems and it allows you to grant them access into your portal. So the reality is crowdfunding is already really happening today with what HR 3606 is talking about. It's just going to take on a whole new dimension. The stats on AngelList are huge. Punchline is well over several $100 million have funded through the platform. That's just a guess by the founders because today they don't have a way to track that. I believe with the Crowdfunding Act, they will have a way to now track that. And I've heard the co-founders talk about that they are going to be a one-stop shop. So they've always been thinking about becoming that crowdfunding portal. On Gust, they've been around for a long time. They were AngelSoft, so if any angel investors are in here that were affiliated with Arthur Ventures, RainSource, and so on, you've seen the system. You may not have realized it. They were the back end, AngelSoft, when you apply to angel groups. So over 125,000 entrepreneurs have used it, and they've been the gateway to 35,000 investors. And now anybody, any one of us in this room can set up your profile on Gust.com on a public portal and then have private access to your confidential information. So here comes crowdfunding. We estimate at DealPen that there's over 400 crowdfunding websites already in the United States alone. There's well over 1,000 in the world. And chances are you haven't even heard of any of these yet. And they're all then preparing themselves for what just got signed into law on Thursday. So this is it, the crowdfunding bill. This magical document was signed on Thursday, and this is where we're going to hand it over to the experts. And that should be live, Jeff. Alrighty.
Hi, Drew. The big headline, we know it all, crowdfunding is here, but the real reality is what it's not as cheap as easy as Patrick might say, and the timeline isn't exactly today. So we'll tell you 5 things that you want to know about the crowdfunding bill in the next slide. Number 1, you're going to raise up to $1 million in 12 months. If you need to raise more, this isn't the game for you. If you need to raise less, that may be fine, but there are going to be different stages above it. Number 2, you have limits of how much money you can take from each investor in an annual 12-month time period. If you're chasing after people whose annual income or net worth is under $100,000, then you're limited to $2,000 or 5% of their annual income and net worth, whichever is greater. If you're chasing after people who have an annual income or net worth greater than $100,000, then you can chase after them for 10% or up to $100,000. So you've got a limit of how much you can get any individual investor for. Number 3, you can't go and just advertise on one of these sites like Kickstarter or whatever and direct the investors to yourself. You have to go through either a traditional registered broker-dealer, and I can tell you that for $1 million, you know how many broker-dealers in this town are getting involved in helping raise money for young companies. The answer is 0. and there will continue to be, I think, zeros. You're going to have a lot of these new things that we call funding portals. Kickstarter will probably become a funding portal. The FCC is going to have a process that you have to register as a funding portal. You have to be part of a self-regulatory organization. You essentially are responsible for being the front runner in terms of trying to police and fraud around this, because it's going to be pretty easy for unscrupulous folks to put up sites and claim they're a funding portal, and then how you're going to get around it. Bottom line, it's just a moment there. But you have to sell through the portal. It's going to handle the funds for you. You don't get to take the funds yourself. It has to go through there. And when you set your minimums, the funding portal won't release until you raise the minimum. And they'll be responsible for posting disclosure documents and things about your company there. And right now, at least unless the SEC comes up with a different rule, you're going to have to actually tell the SEC 21 days in advance what it is you plan on telling investors before you can take money, and that's going to slow things down. Next one, number 4. So there are a series of requirements for companies. This is not just simply a free-for-all that you get to just simply go and say, hey, give me money. No, you're going to have disclosure around your business, around your people, around your principal owners, around how you plan on using funding, risk involved. You're going to actually have to get frickin' lawyers involved to help you on that. That's the reality of the world. And you're also going to have to get your accountants involved, because unless you're only raising under $250,000, where you only need to show up with a tax return, you're actually going to need accountant involvement. So if you're raising between $250,000 and $500,000, you actually have to have an outside accountant review your financial statement. And there's going to be risk for the accountants involved, but that's what they're going to charge you for that. And if you want to raise between $500,000 and $1 million, you're actually going to have some sort of audit of your financial statement, and that's even going to be more expensive. So, and as I said before, you can only direct investors to the portal. You can't actually direct them to yourself to back to your own website to be able to effectuate the transaction there, or go close the deal directly with yourself. And finally, number 5, if not here today, the FCC that has 9 months to come up with a set of regulations for us around this. Then you're going to, once you have the proposed regulations, then you're going to get the passage of those regulations. Then you're going to get to the issue of portals having to register. Then you're going to be able to get the companies actually doing it. It's going to be a year from now before we start actually seeing anything in this area. Now, there are other things that are part of this job building on past that are interesting for fundraising that aren't directly related to what I would call crowdfunding. That's going to be picked up a little bit by some of the other folks in the panel, so I'm not going to say anything more about that. So that's 5 quick things you need to know about the new law. Okay?
Thank you, Jeff. You hand it to Joe.
Joe.
All right, I'm the guinea pig here. I'm a startup CEO, I guess. I use that term loosely. Working with Deal Center right now. Office of the crowdfunding. Happy to take hold of it. We actually see our first financial commitment this week. So we're coming out of
They turned down the volume a little bit because it was too loud the last time, so. Stand up, Joe, you're Italian, we can hear you.
He's an attorney, so I'll speak about it. Okay. So what am I learning about this? I'm learning kind of nothing changes from the standpoint of trying to build a community around what you're trying to do as a startup. However, it does act as a real catalyst to get things moving along very quickly. Obviously, my startup is in the social commerce space. And quite honestly, we don't have a developer co-founder or other people right now, but we had no business even getting funding for our company kind of thing if it hadn't been for what we're trying to do is build a community around our startup. You kind of got to break out of what I would call the Scandinavian DNA we all have here in Minnesota. I'm not naturally outgoing, so people might
Keep talking.
Some people might be really shocked to find that out, but I'm really shy, and you have to kind of force yourself to get out of your shell. That's kind of what I am learning as a startup CEO in Minnesota. And
Check 1, 2.
So just reaching out potential investors, it's how would I would describe
you're trying to get a boulder to the edge of the mountain to create all the downward hill momentum. And it's actually been very successful the way I've been experimenting in some of the different modules we've worked on, in particular LinkedIn. We're on AngelList this week. I just got one of the top VCs in Silicon Valley, considered Forbes Midas list, to be a referrer to us. It was a big kind of a little watershed moment for us on AngelList. So it's just a matter of building all the community. And what that means is not just for money, it's actually getting on the forums and starting to talk to people within the forums who are the VCs and being part of that community. So you've got to be part of the community to build the community. So obviously I'll be open to questions, but those are the things I've learned so far. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Yep, hand it right down. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Harold Slawik. I am with New Counsel, and we're a law firm which works almost exclusively with software and hardware technology startup companies here, primarily in Minnesota, but we have clients out of the state as well. Very honored to be here this morning. Thank you, Patrick, for the opportunity. This legislation is the most exciting thing, I think, that's probably happened in securities law in 80 years. And the President really kind of said as much yesterday. It's a huge, it stands to force a real sea change in the practices for attorneys' accountants, and especially for entrepreneurs trying to raise funding. I think the more interesting and perhaps dramatic change that this legislation is going to prompt is related to the elimination of the ban on advertising. If you as an entrepreneur look at, how can I most effectively and efficiently raise capital, dealing with accredited investors only is the route that provides or poses the least resistance. So this new legislation, and it's completely separate and apart from crowdfunding. This new legislation eliminates the ban on advertising and general solicitation, as it's called in the legislation. So presumably an investment bank or someone like Morgan Stanley, this just may open up the business again to investment banks who seem to have been shut out of the lower end of the market for the last 10, 15 years. So very, very interesting stuff going on there. There's a lot of moving parts in the legislation. There's another very interesting provision which I don't see getting any press at all yet. There's an unused regulation in the securities law called Reg A, which essentially allows you to do something which amounts to kind of a mini public registration and get your shares tradable up to 50. It's the amount of money you can raise this way and float publicly is going from $5 million to $50 million. And the reason this avenue into the marketplace probably hasn't been used is because the dollar amount has been so low. So what this new legislation allows you to do is file a registration statement. You've got to do annual updates, and then you're a public company essentially. You can publicize your offering. You can sell stock. Your shares are freely tradable from the original buyer into successive purchasers. So very interesting stuff. Very interesting possibilities. The legislation. It just seems to open up all kinds of interesting possibilities, particularly for investment bankers and for trusted intermediaries and market makers to small cap markets. So I think that's probably enough.
Thanks, Harold. I am Zach Robbins, and I work with a company called Athlon Capital. We help raise capital for typically much later stage companies, but I've been following this bill for quite some time now, and so the goal of me being here today is just to try to provide, I think, a few sort of guidelines which might help those in the audience that are probably thinking about maybe taking advantage of crowdfunding and to get your company off of the ground. So I'm going to refer to a few points above me. First off, I say that crowdfunding is a means to an end. If your company's primed to take off, you're probably going to need venture capital money down the line. But right now, this is a source for you to get your company off the ground. It's going to be relatively cheap, it's going to be quick, and it's going to be easy, ideally. But it's not going to necessarily propel your company to start. It certainly has its faults, this bill, but it seems to be much better than the alternative. Secondly, the power of users as stakeholders. And what I'm talking about here is that your investors are your users. So literally they are buying into your product. So they're either going to become your biggest fan or your worst enemy if things go south. So I would suggest that down the line, if you raise capital via crowdfunding, that you are going to need to keep in touch with your investors all the time. You're going to need to treat them like a Beaver fan club. Okay, these folks are backing your company, and they're going to need to know what's going on all the time. And you should aim to try to keep them in touch with all of the developments that your company is making. Third, choosing the right platform. Of course, we don't really know yet all of the platforms that are going to launch. There's going to be many of them. But some of the things to consider. Fees, how much these platforms are going to charge you to raise capital. They're going to take some money off of the top. It might be 1%, it might be 5%, it might be 10%. And certainly the SEC is probably going to have something to say about that. Secondly, valuation. This platform is ideally going to help you figure out how much your shares are worth. So you're going to want to make sure that you're choosing a platform that has experience in valuing companies. Third, shareholder rights. So there are going to be certain documents that the investors are going to be signing by investing in your company. And so it's going to be important to have your own counsel to look through those documents and not necessarily just take whatever documents the platform has. The platform is not representing the company that is trying to sell shares. They are representing themselves. So every company needs to have their documents delved into by their counsel to make sure that their rights are upheld. But it's also important to know what the rights of the investors are going to be down the line. Is the investor going to have the right to continue to invest in your company? Are they going to be able to join in, say, a VC round that takes place 6 months later? So certain things to consider. And lastly, just guidance. You just want to make sure that the platform that you choose has experience in trying to raise capital and that they're going to be the best guide for you in your business. Marketability of your company. So what I'm trying to say here is that I think that some companies are going to have to rethink the adage of trying to launch with the minimal product. Things now are going to be a lot more front-facing to the public. When a company raises capital, it's not going to be hush-hush, secretive with accredited investors. It's now going to be front-facing. So companies are going to have to just think a bit more about how they appear to the public, and their companies should consider every tweet they send, every Facebook status update, because they might be scrutinized by potential investors. And two small points. Lastly, that you should be aware of the fact that if you do want to raise capital down the line, that the fact that you are a crowdfunding company might be treated differently by, say, a VC. And the importance of that is just that you're going to have 100 or 200 investors in your company. You're going to have a different cap table than what small companies look like. So that's just something to consider down the line. And lastly, for the time being, since this bill probably won't go through the SEC until 2013, is that AngelList is probably the best route. So if you have any questions on anything that I've discussed, I'll be happy to answer later. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. My name is Colin Hirdman, and when Patrick said that there's a panel of experts, I do not include myself in that. I'm an entrepreneur with a startup, and I just have some, words of encouragement and then just a little bit of a history of what I've gone through just the last few months. So I met Patrick at MinneDemo in January, and I was a complete novice to really what next steps I need to take for my startup. And we engaged in some conversation. And Patrick has really done a phenomenal job at having us go through some of the modules and really understand the landscape and how fast it's changing, and also the ability for us to start leveraging the connections that we have and to create those connections in really, really meaningful ways. And so, looking at some of the various things that we've done with Patrick, whether it's expanding out our network, and I think most of us, we have a network on LinkedIn, building a network through Twitter, and in other ways. I don't think we really realize the power of our network and how far-reaching that can be, and the fact that so many people are out there that want to help you, and once you just get the ball rolling, how impactful that can be for your business. So Patrick didn't want me to plug him, but he's just done a phenomenal job in helping us understand the power of LinkedIn and of YouTube, and looking at our business. Right now our product is B2B, and so looking at a crowdfunding source didn't seem to fit quite right, but we were always looking at a consumer version of our product, and that consumer version seems to fit almost perfectly in what we could do there. And so we're really just laying the groundwork for building out our network, starting to talk to advisors, knowing that these advisors are going to help lead us to potential investors, knowing that there's technology out there to help us get in touch with these investors, and really taking out the middlemen. And as Patrick says all the time, investors want deal flow, and they want to get in touch with people like us. And so entrepreneurs that are out there that have, whatever you're working on, if you're a startup, if you're starting to get some traction, get in touch with people on the panel, get in touch with people like Patrick, let them help you so you can help yourself. And I just think it's really exciting, and this is the unconference, so let's let you guys ask questions.
Excellent. You could just hold on to the mic and we can kind of play it by ear. Thank you, everybody. And by the way, Colin's new product, SMB Tweet, somebody wants to expedite their search on Twitter and so forth. It's a good product to know about. So I've got a couple questions already on CapForum, so I'm going to plug them in here. I'm just going to open up questions on CapForum, and we'll keep plugging from there. And actually insights as well. I want to point out, thank you, Ben. You had pointed out the SCORE offering in Minnesota, which is really unknown, yet that has been a way for people to publicly advertise for investors, yet I'm only aware of a handful of companies that have ever done that. So I just wanted to open up for the panel, especially probably the attorneys. Have we seen anybody use a SCORE offering, or anybody in this room see anybody use a SCORE offering and be successful at it, Lois?
The answer is yes, but it was a while back and I couldn't.
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Exactly. This Doug Ramler, Great Plant Moody. I only know of one company today that's using a SCORE offering. It's called Flightline Enterprises. They've been trying to raise $600,000 for literally the past 4 years. So it's one of the weirder things I've ever seen. Is anybody else familiar with any SCORE offerings?
I haven't had any of them at all in 3 years, so
Okay.
it just doesn't seem to be something on that list.
The next question from Justin Porter. Is Justin in the room? He might be. Oh, excellent. Hey, you're down on the floor. Thanks for coming. What are some of the leading crowdsourcing websites and platforms to check out? Comments? Does anybody want to comment on what they've used or
Sure.
what they should know about? Go ahead, Zach.
Sure. I have a Twitter list, which right now is private, but I will make public. Just about, 12 to 15 sources that I follow. The best, probably crowdsourcing with a dash below it, but I will make this list public. ZJ, Robbins, and then /CFund.
Excellent.
One way, but I follow Patrick, for instance, who posts some different news articles. There's funding pad. Steve Case, who's basically been behind this bill since the beginning. Steve Case is probably one of the best sources on crowdfunding. If anyone else has a different source.
Thank you, Zach. Anybody in the audience have any thoughts, sites they've used? Otherwise, I'm just going to weigh in. I think one of the best sites to use is Indiegogo for business purposes. The big drawback to Kickstarter is that it's creative. So they only take about half the applications, and unless you're launching the new fancy iPhone 5 case, chances are you might not get accepted if you're doing it just for more like business purposes, whereas Indiegogo does not have a screening mechanism, plus they allow you to put up all or nothing campaigns, or you can take whatever money is pledged against your project, which is a much better option for some people. And this is distorted, isn't it? Say that again?
Backer. It's one that recently came out last year. It's the idea
Oh.
of putting up an application, people back it. It's got some interesting mechanisms behind it, but then the idea is that people actually get a kickback and they buy your application in bulk. The site's got all the information. It's kind of difficult to explain the mechanism, but if you go to advocate.com, it's one worth checking out. It's definitely an interesting model.
Right, another one, speaking of that, there's becoming all these niches. There's one called Sprigster. So if you got a franchise, this is one just for franchise owners called Sprigster. So Sprigster popping up all over. This is distorted. If anybody knows how to fix this, I would be very grateful. But it's just going to make my reading TweetDeck hard. I see there's a question down here. Murray, is that your name?
Yeah. With the new bill, my question is about ongoing disclosure requirements. I mean, normally we have quarterly statements. Are they going to be quarterly statements they have to file to render? And what about secondary trading of the equity?
Okay, so the deal in terms of reporting is probably some sort of.
There's going to be some sort of annual reporting requirement. Don't know what the detail is going to be. The SEC is going to come up with it. I don't know if it's going to, run into, 10Qs and 10Ks, which would seem to be a rather burdensome task for small companies. So I assume will be some sort of disclosure light that the SEC will come up with in some sort as part of their rulemaking. And in terms of the resale, you've got a 1-year limitation on being able to resell to anybody who's not an accredited investor. So it doesn't create a trading market right away. So essentially everybody who buys in has restricted securities that they can't immediately go out and resell into a public trading marketplace. But if you think about it, with a small company, is that larger companies have a hard time creating a trading market. I don't think that you can really count on that. The reason you should buy into some small company is because you think there's going to be liquidity immediately. But there is indeed that limitation.
And again, this is really why I think the elimination of the general solicitation prohibition, or the prohibition of advertising with respect to, this really only applies to accredited investor offerings, but so it's as though with this advertising opening up, you can do everything. You can do the whole crowdfunding pitch, if you will, online. You just need to close the transaction offline, and you need to assure that you're only dealing with accredited investors. It's not clear what the regulations are going to be, but the company's required to make reasonable efforts to determine that the investors it is dealing with are accredited. So you can imagine some kind of a portal where you've got voluminous information on the company, maybe a series of companies, some kind of an intermediary, and the ability to click through into a qualification process, and where it becomes a private, directed, secure communication about actually closing the deal. So very, very interesting. And again, there's no annual reporting or filing requirements now if you're dealing with accredited investors only on a so-called Rule 506 offering. So it just looks to me like that's a much for, I mean, a very interesting, low hassle, minimal filing, reporting requirements approach for companies.
Excellent. Jeff.
Yeah, a question for the panel, or anybody in the audience for that matter who is interested, but what's your take on local startup Hooli and their angle on what they're trying to do in the space? And maybe if you want to articulate or describe what Hooli does for those who don't know.
Well, let's see. Let's see if I can articulate correctly what they're trying to do. Essentially, they're trying to identify opinion leaders, and by virtue of the and essentially, let's see. It's been a little. Anybody in here work with those guys? Because I've been through their presentation once, and I now can't quite articulate exactly what what they're doing. But they're essentially trying to create an artificial. Yeah, go.
I would simply call it as they're allowing companies to give shares in their company in exchange for influencers. So if other people weigh in and tell other people about what this company is doing, they can earn some shares.
And I've had some heartache around it. I have to admit I have a little bit of heartache around understanding exactly how they create these large pools of shares out relative to this. And it's actually they kind of hold the shares in trust, and they're kind of divided among opinion leaders based on how influencing they are for a company in the process. I think it's an interesting idea. I mean, obviously, I don't think it's not a fun. I don't know if it will really be a good platform for fundraising for young companies, because one of the things in the crowdfunding bill is if you're an influencer and you're out there trying to push people to buy a particular kind of stock in a particular company, you might be deemed to be somebody who's in the process, especially if you're being compensated for that. You have disclosure issues around your compensation. You have issues around whether or not you're going to have some actual liability for pushing that company's stock. So I think that the jury's out on that, but it's an interesting model.
Thank you. Question via Twitter: will crowdfunding quicken the process to getting capital? Does anybody have opinions and thoughts? Will crowdfunding be this magic bullet that some people seem to think it will be?
Well, I can only take that from my own personal experience. I think it's a catalyst, but again, I'll say that I don't think a lot changes for startup companies. You always have to build a community around your startup. This might make it go faster. Again, going back to the fundraising panel I was just at before this, it sounds like, if you've got 100 investors that you have to deal with as a startup company, that might be a little bit of a distraction from actually executing in the company. So I guess the jury's out on that. I think you just got to do what you've always done, try to build a community around it, get great advisors, get influencers, early access to your company, and just build it that way like you always have. And this is just maybe faster. That's what my hope would be.
Yeah, I think you'd hope it would be faster, but the crowdfunding specific stuff I think is just going to slow transactions down. It's going to force companies to spend more time up front on documentation and getting their financial story.
You mean they don't need to have all those legal documents before they go out and raise money?
Well, you're certainly able to. I mean, networking. Frequently, entrepreneurs are front-loading, creating backlog, right, of potential investors, 15, 20 before they talk to them and help. I wouldn't recommend that, but it happens all the time. So, anybody else?
Any other thoughts? Otherwise, we can go to Prague. I was just going to bring this one out. Is there anybody from an investment standpoint? I personally hate the term angel investors, but because I think a lot of us have all invested in private companies, but a lot of people may not use that term, angel investors. But has anybody invested in private companies and have an opinion about crowdfunding? If you think about an investment you've personally made in a private company, whether it was your neighbor or you put in $100K into something, you have opinions on crowdfunding. Is that right, Prague?
Yeah, I just want to get the take, especially for seed capital, under $100,000, what, I guess, you don't like the term angel. Any investors that are within, you're raising above $100,000, what your thoughts are on crowdfunding prior to the round?
Right. So who, don't be shy. Who wants to weigh in on this that's made an investment? Go ahead, Chad.
Well, I've been on both sides of that table, and as an investor, what you end up with is you end up with a CEO or president or founder who's very distracted with a bunch of people that are asking him a lot of questions. A lot of people don't have the business being in the space in the first place, so they're not sophisticated anyway. A lot of them, it's a material investment for them, 10 or 20 or 50 grand that they put into this startup, and there's a high likelihood that they shouldn't be in the space in the first place. They're spending a lot of founders' time talking about what's happening, what's going on, and sort of distracting that team, if you will, from doing what they said they were going to do. So on the other side of it, as an entrepreneur, getting some of those calls over the years with various people who are non-accredited investors, friends, family, and schools in some cases, being done deals. Most of them worked out good in my case, but there's always the inevitable bad ending.
Right.
And then you have a lot of emotional ties to those people. So a lot of times they are your friends, they are your family, and if it doesn't work out, those are the people you have to see at Christmas, at the holidays, and other places. So just beware.
Excellent. Good guy. Doug, go ahead. Speak up a tad.
One of the perceptions of the angel group I'm in is if you can't get funded through normal channels, then you go to this channel. So AngelList is different in that you're going after successful angels. You're not going after individuals for $5,000 a pop. So I think the expectations for this need to be raising a lower amount of money, getting it from a lot of individuals, and having to manage that. If you're going to go out and raise $1 million through this avenue, I think it's highly unlikely. And again, the investors that I mean, if you get companies through an intermediary through the normal channel, then you probably are rejected by my peers. So now you can go out on the internet and try to take money from individuals. And again, that works, that's fine for a small dollar amount, but for a larger dollar amount, unless you get into a group like AngelList that's focused on successful angel investors, I don't think you're going to be able to raise a larger amount.
Excellent. Well, I think we have time for one more question, comment. Go ahead, Ben.
To answer the question about real estate fundraising easier, I'm wondering about what Harold pointed out, which is we can now advertise.
Right.
Would it be possible under this new legislation to advertise to accredited investors only? Because you can do a regular raise, but maybe are there any new sort of loopholes or creative ways to combine the two?
Well,
Without going to jail?
within so Rule 506 of the Securities Act, there's a component to it called Reg D, and that's how most private placements have taken place to date. And within this Reg D component, the new Jobs Act has created a loophole so that yes, you can publicize a deal to accredited investors now. So your question has been answered by this.
I don't, Zach, actually think that, by definition, if you're advertising, it's public information to everybody. And the legislation is drafted that way. Like, you can advertise your offering. You can only sell to accredited investors. And you need to make reasonable efforts to find out who the accredited investors are, to qualify. And so you're only dealing. So it's, when we deal with investors, we make a sharp distinction between the marketing part of the deal and really the qualifying of the investor and getting yourself into a position where you qualify them, including they're accredited. Then you can, do the deal, do the investment documents and so forth. And this advertising stuff fits that sales model perfectly. Fits it perfectly. So it's about having some discipline in your sales process. But the legislation doesn't seem to have any limitation on your ability to advertise to anyone.
And I guess my point would be is I think we'll see something in the regulations on this, when the SEC comes out, because the SEC may say you can advertise publicly for accredited investors, but you got to have some sort of way of, trying to reasonably believe that you're targeting them in a certain way, or what kind of disclosure, or what exactly the case is. But it's an open question right now. Stay tuned.
So we should say that the FCC is publicly very hostile to this legislation.
Yeah.
And they have a lot of rulemaking discretion. And the securities bar, frankly, is generally speaking highly.
All right, we're going to wrap it up. I want to do just a rapid-fire yes/no gut instinct on this one. This will be the last question because I love Meredith's question. What is your instinct on whether crowdfunding will, you want to hand the mic down to Colin, will crowdfunding, what will the cost of legal and accounting be for crowdfunding versus raising money in general? Will it increase, decrease, stay the same? I'm going to start. I think it'll decrease only slightly. Go ahead, Colin.
Yeah, I agree that I think it would decrease.
I think it depends on the stage of the company. I think younger companies are going to be either thinking, if not spending more money on accounting, legal, and so forth much earlier than they would have in the past. And I think that's actually a good thing for startup companies.
Yeah, I agree with you, Zach. I think that's accurate. I think the Minnesota Angel Tax Credit is a good analogy. It's going to be it's a much simpler process than this crowdfunding process will be. But that invariably slows down the transactions and forces you to be much more organized and disciplined. So,
standpoint of a startup CEO, I don't care. I mean, I do.
You just want the money.
I hope it's really cheap,
Yeah.
and I hope it gives me access to angel investors and other investors beyond the Minnesota ecosystem for my particular type of tech startup.
Service providers take note. Joe will pay.
If the SEC doesn't ruin the concept of being able to do a public offering targeted solely to accredited investors, I think they'll bring the cost of doing those kinds of offerings down. For the raising between $500,000 and $1 million under this system, because you need audited financial statements for crowdfunding, it's going to take your costs way up.
Excellent. That's it. I'm giving a presentation on May 16th and April 19th on crowdfunding. I've got discounts, tickets with me if anybody's interested. Thanks for being here today.